The year is 1936, and in the cities of Spain the army fights against local militias for control in a bloody coup. They are victorious in the south as well as in the centre of the country. However, the Republicans maintain control of various areas in the far east as well as the far north, but crucially also the capital, Madrid. The ensuing stalemate turned into the Spanish Civil War. Having failed at the initial attempt of their coup, the nationalists were further at a disadvantage because many of their troops were stationed in Spanish Morocco as well as the Canary Islands. But it's at this point that they received help from two nations which would greatly alter the balance of the war to come. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy provided arms to the rebels as well as aircraft and eventually also men in the form of the Corpo Truppe Volontari in the case of Italy and the Condor Legion in the case of Nazi Germany. The great boon provided by these two nations' war machines greatly altered the balance of power in Spain, and so the nationalists after 3 years of fighting were able to defeat the Republicans and gain an all-out victory in Spain. 1939 was also of course the year that the Second World War started, and it seems likely that Hitler believed that because of his aid to Franco during the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish would repay this and enter the war on the side of Germany and Italy. Furthermore, Franco was not only morally indebted to Hitler, but also financially, owing a grand sum of $212 million. But when asked, Franco refused and didn't join the Axis side during the Second World War. And in this video, I want to find out, why didn't Spain join the Axis? While Franco himself might have been in favour of joining the war, his council was divided between those who preferred a diplomatic approach with the British and those who preferred one with the Germans. And in 1939, the foreign minister was Juan Luis Begbeder y Atienza, and he was very much pro-British. But during the 1940s, when the Germans were steamrolling across Europe, it seemed that a change was in order because obviously the diplomatic waters were shifting. And so they got rid of this foreign minister and instead added Ramón Serrano Suñer, who was also Franco's brother-in-law and very strongly pro-German. But then in 1942, with the Allied landings Operation Torch in North Africa, the waters were changing once again, and Suñer was removed in favour of Francisco Gómez Jordana Sousa. And he, of course, was much more favourable to the British. So it seems that the Spanish were actually playing rather tactically to keep whoever was winning the war on side, rather than committing to one side or another, at least in terms of their foreign minister, who of course then decided upon foreign policy and that kind of thing. In 1940, and still under the direction of Suñer, the Spanish seem to have come very close indeed to joining the German side and entering the war. They started to sprout anti-British and anti-French propaganda in the media, and there were calls that they would like to take the French colony of the French Protectorate of Morocco, as well as Cameroon, and also the retaking of Gibraltar, which was still being held by the British. However, for the Germans, this last one was too much, as Cameroon had actually been a German colony before the First World War, and so Hitler would not relinquish giving control of it to the Spanish. Later in 1940, Hitler and Franco met on the Franco-Spanish border at a railway station to discuss the plans of possible future alliance. But Franco demanded that Hitler gave grain as well as armoured vehicles, planes, and also fortifying the Canary Islands, which were huge requests from Franco, so Hitler naturally disagreed and the talks broke down, and Spain once again did not enter the war on the German side. It may be that during these negotiations Franco was being simply unreasonable, or it might be the case that Franco never really intended to join the war with the Germans, and that by stating these high demands he knew that Hitler would not accept his entrance to the war. Franco's negotiation had so annoyed Hitler that he later said to an aide, "I prefer to have 3 or 4 of my own teeth pulled out than to speak to that man again." Now, before the breakdown in relations, there had been a fully fleshed out plan called Operation Felix, which was to send German troops from Vichy France through Spain and to attack Gibraltar, because Gibraltar of course was a very strategic location, as whoever controlled Gibraltar controlled entrance to the Mediterranean, and then North Africa, Italy, the Balkan, all of that. So it was a very important strategic location, and as of yet it was still under British control, so the British were able to get into the Mediterranean. Now of course, if the Spanish joined the war, their main adversary would be the British, and the British were a force to be reckoned with, especially on the sea, as the Italians were seeing. The Italians had had a bigger navy than France and Britain combined, but the British were still making absolute mincemeat of them in the Mediterranean. A further reason Franco wanted so much diplomatic and military support from the Germans was because they also had colonies in Africa, and at the moment the Italian colonies as of 1940 in Libya and as well as Southwest Africa were being attacked successfully by the British, and the Italian forces were being routed, and Franco feared that the same would happen to the Spanish colonial troops if they did decide to enter the war at this point. There's also reason to believe that the Germans themselves weren't too desperate to pay the high demands that Franco had on an alliance. For example, part of this was due to Vichy France being a rather useful ally to the Germans, especially at the start of the war in North Africa. Now, the Spanish demands for French Morocco, as well as the Basque and Catalan territories on the other side of the Spanish border in France, to be returned or given to the Spanish, this would obviously annoy the Vichy French, and it feels like the Germans were more in need of Vichy French support at this time than Spanish support. There was also another incentive for the Spanish not to join the war, as they had most of their oil from the United States. And of course, the United States had a close relationship, although not yet at war with the Germans, with the British. And so if the Spanish joined the war, the British would likely tell them, stop trading with the Spanish, and this would put the Spanish economy in serious jeopardy. As a consequence of German help during the Civil War, the Spanish gave several of the profits of their mines to the Germans, supplying the essential tungsten or wolfram ore to the Germans right up until August 1944, when the Allies had closed the border with France. Spanish troops did see action during the war, as they occupied the international zone in Tangier in North Africa in 1940. Although in 1944, with the tide turning, they did actually expel all the German diplomats from this region, which had been an international zone, clearly showing that Spain was definitely not going to be joining the war at this stage. And in 1945, after Franco had promised the British that he wouldn't fortify the area, and saying that it was a temporary wartime measure, they gave the control of the area back to the international community that had held it. Far more Spaniards saw combat on the Eastern Front in the División Azul, the Blue Division, which was a volunteer corps made up of Spanish fascists and nationalists who went over and joined the German army as a volunteer corps in 1941, fighting many famous battles on the Eastern Front, and which is something I have a video about if you want to find out about this in more detail. But by 1943, with mounting diplomatic pressure and the war starting to turn, Franco called back the volunteers, even though some 1,000 diehards did stay and fight until the end, some even making it out of the Battle of Berlin. Now, in 1954 actually was the time when the last of these prisoners who had been captured by the Soviet Union were sent back to Spain, so the war really didn't end for some of the Spaniards, despite them never having actually joined the war in the first place. Spanish involvement during the siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Krasny Bor so annoyed Stalin that he ordered that they would send in an invasion force at the Potsdam Conference after the end of World War II to invade Spain and restore a more democratic government there, or a communist puppet, either way. But the Allies thankfully disagreed with this opinion, saying that they were war-weary and that this would simply cost tens of thousands of more lives, and so the plan for an invasion of Spain was scrapped. Now, interestingly, Spain was actually given a diplomatic and trading embargo for a long time after the war, which is what the Soviets settled with in the end, although once they came out of that, Spain did see an economic boom. Now, interestingly enough, Spain was probably the last of the sort of old class of fascist countries in Europe, although really towards the end Spain moved away from the traditional kind of fascism, especially after the Second World War had shown that it really didn't work very well. Although technically Franco only died in 1975, making it really a remnant of the last era. Alright everyone, so I hope this has been a very interesting video for you. Thank you for watching. I always thought it was quite interesting to see the relationship between Spain and other countries in the Second World War. It's not something that's talked about very often, but you kind of would expect that Spain, having been given so much support by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, would kind of join that corner, join the Axis during the Second World War, but they never did. And in this video I've tried to explain why that is, as well as some other interesting facts. So if you want to know more about the Civil War, which I mentioned at the start of this video, I've got several videos about that, and probably will have several more coming, as well as a really old video about Spain during World War II, which I might remake at some point, but I thought this was an interesting topic to go with. So please do give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new and enjoyed it. I've been Hilbert, and this has been The History.